Think about how easily something like a funny video or maybe some important news travels these days. It just hops from person to person, often in ways you just never predict.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing when you stop and think about it, how connected we all actually are.
Exactly. And that gets right to the heart of this idea, the small world phenomenon. This concept that even with billions of people, you're probably only, what, like 6 steps away from almost anyone?
Uh-huh. It started out as this really fascinating sociological question. How could these short connection chains even exist on such a massive scale?
Right. But the initial observation, that was really just the start.
Absolutely. The really interesting next step and what we're digging into today with our sources is how do we as individuals inside these huge networks actually manage to find those short paths?
Yeah, because we don't have some like global map of everyone's friends, right? So how do we navigate so well?
Precisely. We're using just our local knowledge.
Okay, so to get a better handle on this, the research we're looking at uses a model, kind of like a sandbox for social networks.
That's a great way to put it. Imagine this scenario.
Hmm.
You're in Nebraska in this simulation, and you need to get a letter to someone specific in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
The only rule is you can only forward it to someone you actually know on a first-name basis.
Ah, so only your direct contact.
Exactly. And this model is, well, it's clever because it builds in those key small world characteristics. You've got your local connections, the people nearby, your immediate circle.
Your neighbors, your close friends.
Right. But then, crucially, it also adds these occasional random longer range connections, the ones that can bridge big distances.
Like that friend you made at conference who lives across the country.
Exactly like that. Those are the shortcuts.
So the big challenge in this simulated letter game is how do you, just knowing your friends, figure out who to pass that letter to next so it actually gets closer to Massachusetts?
It's tough. You've only got local information. You're trying to reach a distant target without seeing the whole map.
It feels like trying to navigate a city you don't know just by asking random people for directions to the next landmark.
That's a very good analogy.
Yeah.
And to measure how well this works, the researchers track something called the expected delivery time.
Okay, what's that?
It's basically the average number of steps or handoffs it takes for the letter to get from Nebraska all the way to Massachusetts in the simulation.
Got it. Fewer steps means more efficient navigation. All right, so let's dive into the structure of this simulated world. What does the network actually look like?
Well, the foundation is pretty simple and regular. It's a two-dimensional grid, or what scientists call a lattice.
Like a checkerboard.
Exactly. Imagine each square is a person, and they're connected directly to the people in the squares right next to them and their immediate neighbors. Those are the short-range local ties.
Your close circle. Okay.
Hmm.
And then you mentioned the shortcuts, the wild cards.
Right, those are the long-range connections. They're like extra wires added randomly onto this grid. And crucially, they can connect people who are really far apart on that checkerboard.
Okay, now this sounds like where it gets really interesting. The source mentions this thing called a clustering exponent, alpha. What does that do?
Ah, yes, alpha. Think of it as like a tuning knob for the network. It controls the probability that a long-range connection will form between any two people.
And how does it control it?
It depends on how far apart those two people are on the underlying grid.
Yeah.
So a lower value of alpha means it's actually more likely that these long-range links will connect people who are, geographically very distant on the grid.
So low alpha encourages more of those really long jumps, those cross-country connections.
Precisely. It favors the creation of those big social bridges. The source often uses figure 1A to help visualize this. You see the grid lines and then these extra long-range links overlaid with their likelihood governed by alpha.
Okay, so we have the network.local grid plus these long-range links tuned by alpha. Now, back to the person in Nebraska with the letter. They only know their own contacts. How do they pick the next person?
This is the core of the navigation problem. It requires what's called a decentralized algorithm.
Decentralized because no one has the full picture.
Exactly. Each person holding the letter has to make a choice based only on the people they know directly, their grid neighbors, and any long-range contacts they happen to have. They have zero information about anyone else's connections down the line.
So you make the best guess you can with just your little piece of the puzzle. What kind of guessing strategy do they use in the model?
A key one they explore is called the greedy heuristic. It's actually pretty intuitive.
Okay.
At each step, the person holding the letter looks at all their contacts and passes the letter to the one who is geographically closest to the final target in Massachusetts based on their position on that underlying grid.
Ah, so it's literally move closer on the map at every step. Like, which of my friends lives physically nearest to Boston, even if they don't know anyone in Boston?
Exactly that. Always trying to reduce the grid distance to the target.
Okay, so we have this grid, the alpha-tuned long links, and this always move closer greedy strategy. How does alpha, that tuning knob, affect how well the letter gets delivered?
Well, this is really the central finding, the magic of it.
Yeah.
There's a specific critical value for alpha that makes this kind of efficient navigation possible.
The sweet spot.
A sweet spot, yes. And for a two-dimensional grid like our Nebraska example, that critical value turns out to be alpha equals 2.
Alpha equals 2. What's so special about 2?
When alpha is exactly 2, which means the probability of a long-range link drops off with the square through the grid distance, an inverse square law is something remarkable happens.
What?
A decentralized algorithm, like that greedy strategy, can deliver the letter extremely quickly. The average delivery time scales really well, even as the network gets huge. It grows proportionally to the logarithm of the network size, squared. So log n2, where n is the total number of people, that's incredibly efficient compared to how large the network is.
Wow. So even if the network gets massively bigger, if alpha is 2, the number of steps to find someone doesn't blow up. It grows much, much more slowly.
That's the key. And here's the kicker. The research shows that alpha 2 isn't just one good value. It seems to be the only value where any decentralized algorithm can find the target in a time that scales polynomially with log n.
Wait, really? So if alpha isn't 2, it doesn't matter how smart your local strategy is, you're basically stuck. The delivery time gets much worse.
Precisely. If alpha is anything other than 2, the expected delivery time starts to grow much faster as the network size n increases, possibly polynomially with n itself, which is way slower. It becomes inefficient, regardless of the strategy. Figure 1b in the source shows this really clearly, a sharp peak in efficiency right at alpha 2.2.
That's pretty profound. It's not just having long-range links, it's having them distributed in this very specific mathematical way, this inverse square pattern.
Exactly.
So what's the intuition? Why does alpha 2 work so well? Why does that inverse square thing create this navigational superpower?
Well, the idea is that when alpha is at that critical point, the pattern of long-range connections creates a kind of implicit gradient across the network.
Yeah.
Even though you only see your local connections, the statistical distribution of those longer links means that following the greedy strategy, always moving closer on the grid, is highly likely to put you onto a path that utilizes those long-range links effectively.
So the long links aren't just random, they kind of subtly guide you. Even if you can't see them directly, they create signposts.
That's a great way to think about it, yes. Now, contrast that with what happens if alpha is too high, say alpha 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Then long-range connections are much more likely to form between people who are already relatively close on the grid. They don't bridge the large distances effectively.
So they're not really useful shortcuts across the whole network, more like slightly longer local paths.
Exactly. They don't help you leapfrog across the map. Now, what if alpha is too low, say close to 0, meaning connections are almost purely random, regardless of grid distance?
Then you'd have lots of long connections, right? Shouldn't that be good?
You do have the potential for short paths, yes, but the problem is navigation. Because the long links have no correlation with the underlying grid structure, knowing someone is geographically closer to the target tells you almost nothing about whether they are actually on a good path.
Ah, so the greedy strategy completely breaks down.
Right. You're faced with what the paper calls a disorienting array of social contacts. Lots of options, but no good way to choose the right direction using only local cues.
You have the highways, but no on-ramps you can reliably identify. Makes sense. Okay, this whole model was based on a 2D grid. Is this alpha 2 thing just a 2D result, or does it apply more broadly?
That's a key question. And the research suggests it does generalize. If you consider a network built on a d-dimensional lattice, the critical exponent for efficient navigation becomes alpha equals d.
So in a 3D structure, the sweet spot would be alpha equals 3.
Theoretically, yes. The principle holds. The optimal distribution of long-range links for navigation is tied directly to the dimensionality of the underlying local structure. The researchers also note that simulations, like in Figure 1c, back up these theoretical results for the greedy algorithm.
Fascinating. And the source connects this to real-world systems.
Absolutely. They mention areas like communication networks. Think about how internet packets get routed without a central controller, or even within the brain, how signals travel efficiently between different regions. Neuroanatomy might follow similar principles.
The brain as a navigable small world network. That's a compelling idea.
It really is. And they also nod to work in social psychology and information foraging fields that study how real people actually do search for information and connections, both offline and online. What cues do we use?
So while this model is simplified, it points to a fundamental truth about network structure.
I think so. It highlights this crucial relationship between the local structure, how things are clustered nearby, and the specific pattern of the longer range ties. That relationship seems essential for making these large networks navigable.
Okay, so stepping back, the big aha moment here isn't just that 6 degrees of separation exists. It's not just that short paths are possible.
Right.
It's that our ability to actually find those paths using only our limited local view depends critically on this very specific mathematical pattern, that inverse square distribution when alpha 2 in 2D for how those long-range connections are laid out.
That's it exactly. That specific distribution creates the necessary gradient, the navigational cues within the network itself.
So it makes you think, doesn't it? Consider the online social networks you use every day. Do they feel like they have this kind of navigational efficiency?
Good question.
Are there ways the design, like how they suggest friends or show you content, either helps you find specific people or information, or maybe actually makes it harder? Does it feel like the alpha is tuned right?
That's a really interesting way to frame it.
Yeah.
Are the algorithms creating a structure that's easy to navigate locally? Or is it sometimes that disorienting array?
Yeah. And you could extend that beyond social media, couldn't you? Think about, I don't know, biological systems or even how cities are planned.
For sure. How does the balance between local neighborhoods and, say, major transport routes affect how easily resources or people or even ideas move through the system? Does it impact navigability?
It's a powerful concept, this idea that the interplay between the local and the long range isn't just structural. It fundamentally affects function, affects how we find our way.
Definitely. It shows this surprising elegance in how these different scales of connection have to work together just right to create a world that feels small and navigable, even when it's vast.